All right, this class is on raising the stakes. As I said, more to win and more to lose, raising the stakes. These are the books I've published thus far in my writing career. I write young adult fantasy, and these are my credentials, if you will, why I'm qualified to teach you. I know something about this, and I've taught at many conferences as well. Is your story kind of boring? This happens when you have set out in writing your story, you've thought through maybe some of the really exciting scenes. Perhaps you think you've even outlined it well, but as you get into the actual drafting, you realize that there's lots of uninteresting bits in between those exciting scenes, and you haven't thought through all of the connective tissue really well. And raising the stakes is an excellent way to make sure that you've filled in all those little gaps. So raising the stakes means making sure your main character always has something to lose. That's a quick and easy definition. So what if your story begins with a main character who has already lost everything? I'll give you an example of how one film does this really well, and you can do the same in any other kind of story. So this is a film called Extraction. And Extraction is about a mercenary who is hired from a guy who is imprisoned to rescue his kidnapped son. So the main character is Chris Hemsworth, and he is really good at extracting because he's willing to take like huge risks. He doesn't really care if he lives or dies, but we have to care if he lives or dies, or we're not going to care about his journey that he goes through. So basically, in order to solve this dilemma, you need to make sure that you're giving your main character new things to care about that they could lose. So they may begin at kind of rock bottom like this, but they gain relationships and things along the way that can be stolen from them, taken from them again. And in learning to care about new people and new things, we empathize with them, we start rooting for them, and we start worrying and for them as well, and like living vicariously through them. We're worried that they're going to lose these new relationships as well. So in Extraction, Chris Hemsworth, he's rescuing this little boy. That's his extraction mission. And he comes to care about this little boy. And we learn along the way in little bits and pieces and little flashbacks here and there that he had a child that died at a young age, I think from cancer. And that's what has kind of put him in this place. That death kind of like ruined his marriage, and he basically lost everything he had before and is now this mercenary for hire, but begins to care about a new child and new romantic interests. So you want to give your main character something new that can be lost again, ideally something that represents what they have already lost in the past. And that's the case in Extraction. So think of stakes in terms of rewards and consequences. If your character succeeds, they get something great. If they don't, something terrible is going to happen to them. So I'm sharing the example of Jaws, but I also want to share a quieter story so you can see that stakes are just as important, whether you're writing like a life or death at stake story like Jaws or a epic fantasy or sci-fi. But it works also in quieter stories or like the romantic or character-driven beats of some of those bigger epic stories. So my second example in this presentation is Pride and Prejudice. And if you're unfamiliar with Pride and Prejudice, here's the basic premise on an external level. In Pride and Prejudice, the 5 Bennet sisters won't be able to inherit their wealth and estate, which are entailed to their male cousin according to the laws of the time. If Elizabeth Bennet marries the right man, she'll have wedded bliss and will be able to financially provide for her 4 sisters. If she doesn't, they're all headed straight for poverty. So Elizabeth Bennet is our main character, although there's the 5 Bennet sisters. We see this story play out from her point of view. Okay, we'll come back to Pride and Prejudice in a second and talk about the stakes. But playing into that right now is about making the stakes in a character's world personal. Even if you're writing a big epic story, like a big epic fantasy or sci-fi, like I said, or a thriller, you want to make sure that what's happening in their little world, their little circle of friends or romances or whatever, that's the thing that above all matters most, even though like maybe the world might be coming into an end and that might be at stake too. So instead of making the stakes about the end of the world, make it about the end of your character's world. This subtle shift is an important one, and it's definitely the case in Pride and Prejudice, and it is the case in Jaws as well, because he cares about protecting his own family, and that's really the thing that triggers turning points for him in the story is, yes, he wants to protect everybody, but it becomes very personal when his family is threatened. So what does Brody have to lose if the shark problem continues? His family, they could be killed by the shark. His career, it could come to an end if he fails to protect the people of Amity Island. His own life, he could be killed while trying to hunt down the shark. So you can see all those different levels of stakes and why the tension rises because of all these layers. Now, James Scott Bell, who is a writing craft book author, and I think he has his own works of fiction, but he's my favorite writer of writing craft books. He calls basically any stake a death stake. And those stakes can be literal, professional, or personal. And the reason why it's called a death stake, because whether or not you literally die, whether or not like that's the thing at stake or at risk, it should feel like death if the other kinds of stakes were to happen, like the professional or personal types of stakes. So there's literal, the real death of the body, and that's just blatantly already a death stake. Then there's the professional, the death of a career or a passion, which can be very important as well. And those kind of stakes are in movies and stories like The Queen's Gambit. She wants to be like an amazing chess player. Or The Fugitive, where we have a character like Tommy Lee Jones plays, where it's really important to him that he does his job as, I believe he's a sheriff, really well. And then there's the personal stake, the death of the inner self. And that's in romance stories or character-driven stories or literary stories. If they don't get what they want on a personal level, it should feel like death to them. So I put a little picture of Edward and Bella from Twilight here because it is a very angsty romance, and they definitely feel like they're going to die if they don't end up with the other person. And some people make fun of Twilight because of that, but it's a reason why it was such a wonderful bestseller, is that romantic tension between Edward and Bella and the stakes for that romance. Romeo and Juliet is the same, probably a better written romance because it's stood a major test of time, being Shakespeare, but it's also, they would rather die than be without each other. And if you write romance or are writing a romance thread in your book, it doesn't have to be that angsty, that profoundly angsty to matter as a death stake. But still on some internal level, a part of them is going to feel like they die if they don't get to end up with the other person.